Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is a real personal privilege for me today to be hosting this book event about a book called Transforming Our World, President George H.W. Bush and American Foreign Policy. It's edited by Andrew Natsios, my friend and mentor, and former Secretary of Transportation, Andy Card. And it is got a series of really fabulous essays by some really noted practitioners in diplomacy and foreign policy, and we have several of them with us today. I'm going to do my best, try not to get choked up, because I owe a lot to George H.W. Bush. I worked on his re-elect campaign in 1992. I slept on a couch in the primary. I was an intern for him in the Bush 41 White House, working for Dan Quayle, and I worked for people like Bill Kristol and Senator Bill Hagerty and David Rivkin, and I became a convinced Republican, a convinced conservative, and a convinced conservative internationalist because of serving the George H.W. Bush administration. I've got a personal story I want to tell. It was December of 1990, and President Bush was traveling to South America, and there had been a coup attempt in Argentina about 36 hours before he was going to visit Argentina. And the Secret Service told President Bush, "We cannot protect you. We cannot guarantee your safety." President Bush went anyways. There were unfair and not accurate accusations that George H.W. Bush was a wimp. He was a war hero. It was total baloney, disinformation. He went in and bravely to Argentina, gave a speech in front of the Argentine parliament, helped bolster Carlos Menem, who was a reformist president of Argentina, who made a lot of significant changes. There were some criticisms on him, but he made a lot of significant changes, one of which was he ended Argentina's isolationist foreign policy that had gotten them nowhere over 60 years. And Argentina sent boats, naval assets to the Gulf War Coalition later in 1991. And so he basically helped bolster Argentine democracy. My father-in-law was the foreign minister at the time. He was later finance minister. And George H.W. Bush is a beloved figure in Argentina. So I hope you'll allow that point of personal privilege. We've got, but there's tons of stories like that. There's tons of, and he's not, he needs to be more well-remembered, President George H.W. Bush. He was really, I think, one of our greatest foreign policy presidents ever. And I think this book really helps to solidify that. We've got a fabulous lineup. The two editors are Andrew Natsios, who's at the Bush School at Texas A&M at the Scowcroft Institute, and Andy Card, who was the former Secretary of Transportation in the George H.W. Bush administration, and later he was chief of staff to George W. Bush. We have 4 panelists later. Those panelists are Ambassador Carla A, one of America's greatest public servants and a leader on trade issues. She's also one of my bosses because she's on the CSIS board, so I'm going to hope to do a good job. We have Ambassador Pickering, who is really one of America's greatest diplomats and represents the best of the Foreign Service and really the best of America. I'm so pleased he's with us. My friend Catherine Bertini, who's a senior advisor at CSIS. Both Ambassador Pickering and Catherine Bertini both have longtime affiliations with CSIS, so I'm really pleased that they've agreed to do this. And then we have Douglas Paal, who wrote a really interesting chapter about George H.W. Bush and China. So I have only a couple of complaints, and I know that Andy Card and Andrew Natsios knew that I was going to probably make these complaints, and they referenced them in the introduction, that there was not enough attention on the Central American peace process. I think my friend Diana Negroponte is watching this video, and she wrote a fabulous book recently about the El Salvador peace process. She also wrote a recent book about Jim Baker and talks about this. And so that's one complaint. My other complaint is that there's not a chapter on the Brady Plan, which helped rescue Latin American economies. But I know you recognize both those. But other than that, it's got like 15 fabulous chapters. So really, it quibbles at this point. But let me turn to the conversation I want to have with Andy Card and Andrew Natsios. So Andy and Andrew, thank you for being here. You're both really busy people. So why did you write this? Why did you edit this book? You all have other things you could do with your time. Why did you both decide to agree to edit this book?
Well, conceptually, we thought of this when, after President Bush died. We have been with President Bush when he was Ambassador Bush, running for president in 1979, I believe, Andy, if I recall correctly. And I have a funny story because he called me. Andy and I were both in the legislature. Andy was the chairman of the campaign in Massachusetts in 1979-80. And I was the co-chairman with Paul Cellucci, later became ambassador to Canada and governor of Massachusetts, and Leon Lombardi, who later became the chief justice of the land court in Massachusetts. Anyway, he called me on the phone. And I thought it was a joke, and I was going to hang up. And my uncle had been in the American embassy in Tehran, and he knew the Shah and the Ayatollahs had taken over, and we weren't really sure who these guys were. And my uncle said, these guys are extremely dangerous. We're going to regret not stopping this. And so I decided to ask him what he thought. And he gave an intimate explanation of what was happening and said that the Carter administration was misjudging this and that we needed to do something before bad stuff happened. And it turned out he was right. And I said, this really must be George Bush, because no one else could have answered the question that way. And so I was glad I didn't hang up on him, as I thought it was a college friend of mine playing a joke. And so that was my first conversation with him. Andy probably has other conversations like that. But we decided to do this because many of the people are dying, unfortunately, who participated in the administration. Now, Larry Eagleberger has died. I could go through the list. He was Deputy Secretary of State at the time. And so we needed to capture the memories of the people who participated in the events that unfolded. George Bush is a very modest guy. He didn't like to promote himself. And he had a lot to promote, in my view. And so that's the other motivation in writing this. Andy?
Well, first of all, I would say I'm not much of an editor. But Andrew Natsios is a very, very dear friend, and he's an outstanding editor. I was a facilitator and got to ride Andrew Natsios's coattails, much the way I rode George H.W. Bush's coattails to phenomenal experiences in life. But I first met him when he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he came to Boston to give a speech, and I was planning to run for the state legislature. And I was thrilled when I got a call saying, you have a free ticket to go hear the chairman of the National Republican Party speak in Boston. And I'm thinking, free? I didn't have any money. So I was all of a sudden, I went there, and it was a very sparsely attended event. It was the height of Watergate. And Chairman Bush got up to give a speech, and I will admit he wasn't the most commanding presence in the room, and his rhetoric was not soaring, but his remarks were unbelievably relevant and on point. And this was at a period of time when our democracy was fraying and the institutions of democracy were being challenged. Watergate and Vietnam, there were lots of challenges. And he was remarkable in talking about the role of our democratic institutions, including the institution of a two-party system, and what it meant. And I was very impressed with I'm going to say the language he used, which was inclusive, not exclusive, and the role of our institutions in making sure that our democracy works, because it's the example for the rest of the world to see. So I was very impressed with him. And he actually defended the institutions that were being attacked, the institution of the White House, the institution of the Central Intelligence Agency, the institution of the Defense Department. He talked about the institutions of the two-party system and what it means to get people to run for local office and have them go up the chain of command, if you will, and opportunities. I was just very impressed with him, even though I admit his speech was not a rousing campaign type speech, and it didn't call us to be partisans. It just said, get involved and make the democracy even better. Respect the institution. So that's when I first met him. I then, as Andrew mentioned, he and I served in the legislature together. Both of us had very challenging re-election battles in 1978. And that was because the legislature in Massachusetts was being reduced in size from 240 members to 160 members. And I had a very tough re-election battle going on. And I ended up winning, and I got a call from Bob Dole, who had been the Republican nominee for vice president at the 1976 Republican National Convention. And he said, congratulations on your victory. I didn't even know I had won yet, but he said, I'm going to be in Boston next weekend, and I'd love to meet and talk to you about what my thoughts are about maybe running for president. And I was very flattered. Number one, I didn't know that I had won yet, so I had to pretend I was excited to win, but I wasn't sure that I did. I did win. I then went and met with Bob Dole, and I had met him when he was running for vice president. And I said to myself, you know, I want to find out everybody who's running for president. And it was a long list. I think there were 16 candidates or 17 candidates. And I naively sent a note to every one of them saying, hey, I'd like to learn more about you. I got notes back from everybody I wrote to except for John Conley, who never responded. And I ended up meeting with every candidate because they had to come to Boston in order to get to New Hampshire to campaign. So I would make arrangements to see them at Logan Airport or whatever. And I met with all the candidates, and George H.W. Bush, George Bush, Ambassador Bush, was by far the nicest person and the kindest person and the most interesting, and could have wonderful conversations with you. And I just got to know him and traveled with him, used to pick him up at Logan Airport and drive him around. And then he asked me to become the chairman of his campaign in Massachusetts when he ran for president, trying to get the nomination out of Massachusetts. And I will admit, he had no expectation that he would win Massachusetts if he did run for president or vice president. He just thought he could raise money in Massachusetts. So we were focused on raising money. I was focused on getting votes. The truth is, he did very well in Massachusetts, won the Republican Party nomination from Massachusetts. At any rate, his race for the presidency had me as kind of playing a Forrest Gump role. I happened to be with him on many historic times and some not so historic times. I'll give you one anecdote. The very first time that I got a call from the chairman of the campaign, or the one who was managing the campaign, was James A. Baker III. And he called me up and he says, hey, it was right after I'd signed on as chairman of the campaign in Massachusetts. And he says, Ambassador Bush has a speech in Hartford, Connecticut in 2 weeks. It would be great if you could he's got a few hours in the afternoon free. Could you put something together as a fundraiser maybe and meet some people in Springfield, Massachusetts? And I said, oh, I'd be glad to do that. I didn't really know anybody in Springfield, Massachusetts, but I went to a friend who did and found this woman who said she would host a tea party in the afternoon, like 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Springfield. And I was all excited. I had to first drive out and find out where this person lived so I could get there. Then I drove down to Hartford, Connecticut, picked up Ambassador Bush after he had given a speech, and then had to return to give another speech that night. And we're in the car talking. We were having a great conversation. We arrived at this event in Springfield, Massachusetts. There were about 20 people there. It's very nice afternoon tea. And they have a sign on their mantelpiece, "Welcome George Bush." And it was spelled B-U-S-C-H. They thought he was part of the Anheuser-Busch family and running for president. And he says to me, I guess we've got name recognition problems in Massachusetts. But at any rate, I became very close friends with George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush as a result of picking them up at Logan Airport and driving them to important places like Concord, New Hampshire, and Nashua, New Hampshire, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then actually worked very hard on the campaign, and he ended up being very successful, and I was part of his team all along. So that's how I get involved. This book is not about a campaign. This book is really about the kinds of people that George H.W. Bush attracted to be part of his team, and the temperament and the knowledge and the breadth of trust that he had for people on his team. And he was an empowering leader. And I'm so impressed with the people that did write chapters for this book. Almost every one of them did make a difference in not only the life of this country, but the changing the world. And yes, it is not the complete story of the Bush administration. It is the story of his role forming this piece of kind of national security challenge and the remarkable people that made it happen. I wish Brent Scowcroft had been alive so that he could write a chapter, but we do have chapters written by people who know what he was like to work with and the relationship that he had with George H.W. Bush. But Andrew Natsios is the true editor. He went and read every word and made sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, and it was appropriate. I would recommend people read Andrew Natsios's foreword to the book. It really does describe kind of the nature of the man we're talking about. But every chapter really talks about George H.W. Bush and how he motivated other people to do their job and the kind of job that they did. He was the best leader. Truth was very important to him. And he recognized that. He used to challenge us to make sure he would challenge me. Are you telling me the truth? And yes, so truth was important. He also understood that you have to have common sense. You have to have good vision. You have to have peripheral vision. You can't just have tunnel vision. So everyone that he invited to be part of his team had some tunnel vision, but they also were encouraged to have peripheral vision as they did the job. And these different chapters tell important aspects of the way the Bush administration did its job. And at an unbelievably challenging time, and it wasn't challenging in any one spot over another. Every spot around the world was challenging, including challenges in our own country. And I think this book is important, and it's important because, number one, Andrew motivated everybody to do it. Number two, he got people to write chapters thoughtfully. And number three, he edited them to make sure that they wove the story together and kind of said the complete way that George W. Bush was the remarkable man that it was. I want to point out that there's also a discussion by someone who was not part of the administration, and he happened to have been a major player in Germany. And as we were working to deal with the aftermath of the Berlin Wall coming down, and it's just, this is a good book. Now, is it going to be a bestseller? Is it something that you want to read at night to your grandkids as you put them to bed? No, but this is something that should be read by anyone who cares about what CSIS thinks about. And so thank you very much for hosting it, Dan. And I look forward to, Carla Hills and Tom Pickering and Doug Paal, and it just remarkable people, and we're fortunate to have them here. But most remarkable is Andrew Natsios convinced people that they should take the time to write a chapter about President Bush's tenure and the challenges that he met and how he did it. And I'm particularly grateful for Jane Lute for writing a chapter, because she kind of captured what was going on in the National Security Council culture around Brent Scowcroft and President Bush. So that's an interesting chapter as well.
Thank
Can I
you.
just make 2 quick points?
Yes, sir.
We had someone going to write about Latin America. He's a senior career diplomat, and he was involved in some events, but I'm not going to go into who he was. I'm trying to get him to write an article that we will fund. I think he's retiring now, to write about the Panama intervention, which was highly successful, the peace process in Central America, the Brady Plan, and some other things that Bush did in Latin America that are not well known. That's why we had someone, and then he backed out the last minute. So that's the reason that chapter didn't get written. The second thing I want to say is, this is something that Bush is not known for, and it's not in any of the other books that have been written. George Bush, in many ways, created, or his appointees created, the international humanitarian response system. And the reason Catherine Bertini is so important is she was the executive director of the World Food Program, which is now the largest UN agency. And many career people in the UN system will say that she was the greatest of all of the agency heads in the history of the UN. And in many ways, she created help. Now, she's a modest woman, so I don't want to, but she created the humanitarian response system, which has been highly effective. Bush actually shifted the focus of American foreign policy to people, to poor people who are being, who are at risk in these conflicts, because there was a massive increase in the number of collapsed states while he was president because of the end of the Cold War. And so we have a large number of chapters on the humanitarian side of the administration. He's seen as a sort of a hard realist, when in fact, there's this other aspect of his presidency that's not well known. And so we put those chapters in there. I think there are 4 or 5 chapters, a quarter of the book on that aspect of it, because it's not been covered in the other histories very well.
All right, so I want to ask each of you, we have 10 more minutes. So Andy, let me turn to you. What are the takeaways? So you were chief of staff to George W. Bush. You served in the cabinet of George H.W. Bush. What are the big takeaways for policymakers for today and for the future from this book?
I would say the most relevant perch that I had in terms of watching presidents do their job were, number one, deputy White House chief of staff to George H.W. Bush when John Sununu was chief of staff, and then chief of staff to George W. Bush. And frequently people want me to compare the two of them. It's different because I was different. George H.W. Bush was kind of like my dad. Now, Ronald Reagan, who I also worked for, was kind of like my grandfather. And, you could go into President Reagan and have him talk to you. And then if he said something that you didn't agree with, you kind of said, it's okay. He's like my grandfather. I'm not going to criticize him. George H.W. Bush was like my dad, and he could say something that you disagreed with, and you challenged him about it, and then you felt guilty. George W. Bush was like my brother. When he said something stupid, I could say something about it, and I didn't feel guilty. So there were different contexts. But George H.W. Bush was someone who really understood the institutions of democracy and the value of personal relationships in creating, I'm going to say, a climate of respect. So he would give respect, and he would not command respect, he would earn respect. And that was a remarkable thing, but probably from George H.W. Bush would forget that he had enemies. So almost everyone who had been a perceived enemy, he viewed as a potential friend. And so he didn't hold grudges very much. I can only think of 3 or 4 people that he would hold grudges. That's not the case with most other presidents. He was also, he was very inclusive in making decisions. He welcomed the counsel of Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft. And he did not want monolithic thinking in the Oval Office. He would challenge those who were offering advice. And if they all were saying the same thing, he would say, it can't be that easy, because if it's that easy, the issue wouldn't come to me. So what's the difference? And he almost welcomed, I'm going to say, thoughtful arguments. He didn't like people being a bully in the meeting. And he was quick to identify someone who felt bullied and would call on them and lift them up to be part of the conversation. So I think that was a remarkable attribute that he had. And I think that he learned that through his various experiences before he became president. I mean, his resume is truly unique among anyone who has ever served as president of the United States. And he did learn, but I also think, as Andrew Natsios points out in the preface to the book, he grew up in a family where public service was considered to be noble and to answer the noble call of public service. So he was brought up in a climate of respect for the institutions of democracy and our role in it. George W. Bush, it's not fair because he and I are roughly the same age. And so I saw him as, I could be very candid with him and have, I used to taste your words before you spit them out. That's an important thing to do, and sometimes he didn't always taste his words before he spit them out. George H.W. Bush always tasted his words before he spit them out.
Andrew, what's the message of this book? What are the takeaways for foreign policy related to this book?
Well, the first is something that's often forgotten. the most important function of the President of the United States is to appoint other people to positions to run the federal government. One person cannot possibly run the federal government, no matter how brilliant they are, no matter how experienced they are. And George H.W. Bush had more experience than almost any other American president. He was the first president in 150 years who was actually an experienced diplomat, who had diplomatic positions before he was in office. And so he spent that's why we had Chase Undermeyer write a chapter on personnel, how he staffed the foreign policy apparatus of the United States government. And many authors have noted, historians have noted, that his team did not engage in a lot of infighting. He also knew so much that everybody knew once he made a decision, you were expected to carry the decision out. And in playing games, he did not like people playing games. And as a result, he chose people who did not engage in a lot of Byzantine intrigue. And I think that's what the first message. The second message is an attention to detail. This is something also that's missed a lot. If you look at the studies of the federal government and foreign policy, developing policy is actually not relatively easy, but it's the easier part of the whole process. The hardest part is implementing it. Implementation is the place that we fall, we make mistakes to the greatest historically, from a historical standpoint. And it's those mistakes in implementation that have led to some catastrophes in American history. And I think George Bush spent more time as a president of the United States carefully, methodically implementing policy. And that's why he had so few failures. If anything, the failures were he did not intervene, some like in Afghanistan, he's criticized on that. Although Ryan Crocker was saying, Andrew, he didn't do enough on Afghanistan when the war ended. I said, did you know the first executive order he signed as president was to start the reconstruction process? And he put AID in charge of it in the executive order and said AID will be in charge, one agency, and he got money through to do it. And then he got Congress to approve it. That's almost lost. It was all the stuff AID did in Afghanistan. It was all destroyed during the Civil War that took place after he was president. But it wasn't because he didn't do something. It's because other events took control of the situation, unfortunately, in Afghanistan later on. So I think implementation and attention to detail is why he was so effective as an American diplomat and as president.
Okay, great. Okay, I think this is excellent. I think let's move to the panel. We have 4 panelists who are really going to help us unpack, who've each contributed chapters to the book. Again, Frank Lund says you need to repeat a title of a book 7 times so people remember it. So again, this is Transforming Our World, President George H.W. Bush and American Foreign Policy. So we have 4 panelists. We have exactly, Andy. We have Ambassador Carla Hills, who was U.S. Trade Representative under George H.W. Bush. We have Ambassador Tom Pickering, who was Ambassador to the United Nations under George H.W. Bush. We have Catherine Bertini, who served in the George H.W. Bush administration and was appointed by the United States in the George H.W. Bush administration to lead the World Food Program, which she led for 10 years. And then subsequently, she was Undersecretary for Management of the United Nations. And we have Douglas Paal, who was Director of Asian Affairs for the National Security Council under George H.W. Bush. All 4 of them wrote really interesting chapters in this book, Transforming Our World. So let me start with Ambassador Hills. Ambassador Hills, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed your chapter. In many ways, at the beginning of the George H.W. Bush presidency, it wasn't necessarily clear that there was going to be a NAFTA, but by the end of the George H.W. Bush presidency, you and the George H.W. Bush administration launched a decade of deeper trade ties. Tell us how that happened.
Well, Dan, let me say it's a pleasure to join you. You know, when President Bush took office in January of 1989, although a North American free trade agreement was not on his early trade agenda, he strongly believed in the opening of global markets and hemispheric markets, recognizing that doing so would not only create commercial opportunities for our people, but also enable us to work together with other nations to enhance our security. I mean, he is the one who said, I have a dream of having free trade from the tip of Alaska down to the tip of Argentina. And if he'd stayed in office, we may have gotten there. But just to remind you that in 1989, we were heavily occupied with the Uruguay round negotiations. We had just finished a bilateral trade agreement with Canada, which was fractious. We were seeking to open the Japanese market, which was highly restricted, and I could go on and on. But in January of 1990, a year later, when Jaime Serra, Mexico's trade minister, and I were at Davos, Jaime raised the issue saying, you know, President Salinas would very much like to have a trade agreement with the United States because he believes that that would help us advance and open up the Mexican economy. And both of us knew that the two presidents were going to meet in June. And Jaime wanted President Bush to announce that he would move forward then. On my return from Davos, I discussed the possibility with President Ford, and he agreed that it was an opportunity. But first, we needed to obtain fast track authority from Congress, which guarantees that Congress votes up and down and doesn't play around with amendments that kills the prior negotiations. And that would require us to do an enormous amount of consulting with both members of Congress and the private sector. And as you know, under the terms of fast track, the president gives notice to the Congress to have his intent to negotiate a trade agreement with a particular country or group of countries, and an outline of objectives, which starts as 60 legislative days before you can move forward. And if that goes through, and Congress cannot add amendments. And our view was in June that with the congressional summer recess approaching, along with the midterm elections, that we should wait until the members returned in the fall to begin the process. And after President Bush and President Salinas met in June, word got out that we were contemplating a free trade agreement with Mexico. And that led to a call from John Crosby, who was then the trade minister of Canada, who said, wait a minute, Canada wants to join. And that really surprised me because the US-China trade agreement was so fractious in Canada, it almost brought down Brian Mulroney's government. But over Labor Day, Brian Mulroney was the house guest of President Bush at his Kenny-Bunkport home. And he made it clear that Canada very much wanted to join, and President Bush responded affirmatively. And in the November elections, that brought a lot of new faces to Congress, and we spent weeks and weeks consulting and obtaining advice from Chairman Rostenkowski and Representative Archer on Ways and Means, Chairman Lloyd Benson and Bob Packwood of the Finance Committee, along with a list of other members, business organizations, mayors, governors, I could go on. And on March 1 in 1991, we formally requested fast track to cover our negotiations. And after the June 1, 60 legislative days for Congress to disapprove, we got down to the business of real negotiations. And I can tell you those negotiations were intense. But 14 months later, which is a miracle in today's market, in August of 1992, we stood up, shook hands, and we had an agreement of the first comprehensive free trade agreement to join a developing economy with developed economies. and we created a market of $23 trillion and 494 million consumers. And the agreement not only eliminated tariffs on all industrial products and on most agricultural produce, it was the first trade agreement to open a broad range of services and to remove significant obstacles to inward investment. And it was the first trade agreement to establish enforceable protections for copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. And today, Mexico and Canada are our two largest export markets, and we continue to work together on a range of issues. And President George Herbert Walker Bush provided the leadership that contributed to the strength of our economic and strategic relationships with our two neighbors. We have benefited enormously from his wisdom, thoughtfulness, and experience as our 41st president. And it persuades me that those traits, plus his experience as congressman, ambassador to the UN, as our envoy to China, as our vice president, experience matters. And we are so fortunate as a nation to have been blessed with his leadership.
Thank you, Ambassador Hills. Thank you. Ambassador Pickering, thanks for being here. You were ambassador to the United Nations during a series of challenges, and you were called upon to ask a lot of our partners through the United Nations process. Talk about, and he also had served, President George H.W. Bush had been ambassador to the United Nations, so he knew a lot about what the United Nations could and couldn't do. So talk a little bit about, you wrote a really interesting chapter in the book. Talk about George H.W. Bush and the United Nations.
Dan, thanks very much. And it's an honor to join you and all the others here today for a remarkable book, which I read with the greatest of interest. The United Nations during President Bush's time, perhaps in the Security Council, was most challenged and perhaps performed best. And I say that because both President Bush and Secretary Baker played an enormous role in getting the United Nations moving and dealing with its players. It played an enormous role in the first Gulf War. A great surprise to me on August 1st, having dinner that night with a very small group, was that I was in effect pulled out of the dining room into the pantry by the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and told that Iraq had invaded Kuwait. We should call for a Security Council meeting right away. And that started it all, and we did. And the Security Council was coming out of the Cold War. It was coming out of the collapse of communism, which took place the end of that year. But it was in many ways not structured, practiced, or indeed made for this kind of a test, even though that's how the people who wrote the charter saw it happening. And we went through three phases there that were very, very important. Phase one was essentially leading up to the use of force resolution. Phase two was after the use of force resolution. And phase three was solidifying the end of the conflict in the Security Council. There were many other things that we did, but this was perhaps the most fascinating and interesting time for anybody to be at the United Nations, and one where for the first time we were able, over a period of time in each of the successive resolutions dealing with Iraq, to be able to count on the support, but certainly the non-opposition of both Russia and China, something that hadn't taken place before that and hasn't since in a very serious way. And in large measure, that was because the relationships that the president had established and the Secretary of State with those countries were tremendously important in bringing them along as we move through the process. Just a few, I think, highlights of that to give you a sense of what was involved. For the first time, the Security Council actually moved with a serious unanimity to approve the involvement of outside players militarily, if necessary, in dealing with the state-to-state aggression, Iraq's invasion and indeed total capture of Kuwait. Secondly, we did so in a way through a series of resolutions that empowered in many ways the president to deal particularly with recalcitrant members of Congress when the second stage, the internal legislation required to involve our forces if necessary, was passed by the Congress. And it's my sense that without the resolutions of the Security Council, a number of people, particularly in the Democratic Party, who were still, put it this way, suffering some of the agonies of the post-Vietnam era, would have, in fact, tried to vote that down. They didn't, and it was very helpful to do it. At the end of the war, we played a very interesting role. We wrote a resolution that was the longest, perhaps, ever done up until that time by the United Nations Security Council to cover every aspect of settling peacefully what went on. We did not ask Iraq for its opinion. The members of the Security Council together very hard to negotiate the resolution. We provided for all kinds of things, including the return of prisoners, the return of stolen property, setting up a compensation, using oil money from Iraq to pay for damages done, peacekeeping forces, a whole range of activities. It's the first time that the UN had ever stepped into a situation of that sort and basically said, here is the peace treaty at the end of the conflict. Iraq was told, you agree to this peace treaty or you will suffer the consequences of a continued conflict on your backyard. This was very significant. I admired President Bush enormously. He was, in every sense of the word, in continuous contact with us, as was Secretary Pickering, as we went through this process. There were efforts to, in fact, derail our negotiating approach from time to time by states that in one way or another had different ideas. We had all hoped that sanctions would work, but we had our serious doubts from the beginning. The use of force resolution was in itself unique and unusual, but it provided in a very serious way for the coalition that we had built of over 60 countries, 35 troop contributors roughly, and more than 500,000 American forces in the region, actually to do what was necessary to expel Iraq from Kuwait. And that happened in timing that was quite surprising. After a several month air battle, within 3 or 4 days, that took place. Many have complained that President George H.W. Bush was mistaken in not going on to Baghdad. Here we are all those years later, still in Baghdad. And not going on to Baghdad was perhaps the smartest move he made, the one that I think had the most cogency to it, and perhaps the wisest step he took in the whole process. He knew and he understood what a morass it would be, what an endless conflict it would be, and how uncertain would be the process of winding it down if indeed that had happened. There were a number of other things that happened that have been mentioned already. Certainly we dealt with Panama. We had a serious set of problems that took place as an agreement to set Namibia free as a new state in Southern Africa began to unfold and then unravel and were put back together by the United Nations. We repealed the infamous Zionism is racism resolution during the course of the years that I had the honor to serve there. And we had an enormous amount of what I would call popular support. So much so, and Dan, I have to mention very frankly at the end, that we were so successful in Iraq that we went into Yugoslavia and Somalia thinking that all we had to do was to pass the resolutions and everything would fall into our plate. The truth was, since we were not prepared to engage large numbers of forces, and the truth was that since others were not prepared to help us in those particular activities, and since there were paramount differences between the players as to how and in what way the breakup of Yugoslavia should be handled, and how and in what way the ongoing, almost endless insurgency in Somalia should be dealt with, they stuck around for much too long and represented what I would have called something, had we thought more about it, perhaps we would have and should have done a little bit differently. But thank you for the chance to set this out. And thank you again for the opportunity to contribute to this great book.
Thank you, Ambassador. Catherine Bertini, thank you for being here. George H.W. Bush's humanitarian contributions are not as immediately recalled, but were, as Andrew Natsios was saying, really quite important, partially for the many things that didn't happen, the many bad things that could have happened. Could you discuss some of President George H.W. Bush's contributions on humanitarian leadership?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and I was honored to be asked to write a chapter in the book. He is all of the leader that both ambassadors were just discussing, including in humanitarian area. And I think there's 4 reasons why he was so many of us looked up to him and were able to do the job that we did. One was that he started with sound policy, and he set up the broad policy pieces, and then the rest of us were responsible for defining those and moving them forward. So for instance, my chapter I titled from a phrase from his inaugural address, "To make kinder the face of the nation and gentler the face of the world." And remember, he said he wanted to make a kinder, gentler America, a kinder, gentler world. You know, in jobs like the ones that I had in the administration in the UN, you didn't need a lot more direction than that in order to focus your own work toward that. Or even when he said when he gave the speech that was called the New World Order speech in 1990, when he said he wanted open borders, open trade, and open minds. And again, that gives a lot of direction to people about what they're doing next. So the second thing, I think, beyond the broad policies was the people, or were the people. So he appointed really good, competent people, and then let them run with it. And it's easy to see throughout, not only throughout the book, but looking at the history of the administration, the kind of people he appointed. And then 3, his international understanding, as Andrew said, and as Chase Undermeyer said in the book, there'd been no one in the last 128 years who had been a diplomat before. Everybody I interviewed for the chapter I wrote said the reason why he was so effective in humanitarian affairs is because he had been at the United Nations. He had been in overseas assignments. And so he understood how it worked and what needed to be done. And then finally, he was a people person. I bet everybody on this panel has multiple cards in their files of notes he wrote to them, or records of phone calls that he made, because that's just how he was. And he really valued his interaction with people. So I'll come back to, for instance, Brian Mulroney, who was mentioned, who Ambassador Hills mentioned, and who wrote one of the blurbs on the book. But that's one example of the very close relationship that the two of them had. They could be easily called on, whether it was trade or the Conference on Children, the World Summit on Children, or whether it's a humanitarian program or anything else, and immediately cut through a lot of other red tape and get something done. So on humanitarian, very specifically, several things happened during his administration. One was one in which Ambassador Pickering and his team were very much involved, because it was the creation ultimately of the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which is now called OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN. Up until that time, there wasn't any formal coordination, except for a very small office for disaster assistance. And so this, with strong support from the US government, became then the coordination mechanism for the UN. And it has a lasting impact, even up until this day, in many, many different ways. And just as the example of the congressional resolution regarding the Iraq war, there was a congressional resolution also calling for coordination within the UN around the same time. So there was a lot of interactive work done by the administration, on one hand with Washington, and on the other hand with New York. That was done, the coordination work and the resolution creating it was done just in time, because the South African drought hit in 1992, in Southern Africa drought, and I think 18 million people were impacted or potentially impacted by that drought. It didn't get a lot of press, in part because there was a lot of work that went into it, including the major donor being the United States of America, to not just to get food in, but to cut red tape in order to move food. For instance, apartheid was still the law of the land in South Africa. And while South Africa was not as impacted as some of the rest of the countries in the region, we needed to use the ports in South Africa in order to get food into landlocked countries. So there was a lot of coordination done with a lot of help from not just the UN, but the US in order to facilitate the cross-border operations between South Africa and other countries, just as one example. Another example is Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, which, as you recall, in 1992 was absolutely essential to be able to feed people in Somalia, and was done at the insistence of President Bush. And Operation Restore Hope was a big success in feeding people. It just ended up changing its focus later on after his administration, and obviously causing more problems over the long term. Andrew asked me to include in my chapter a story about the World Food Program, because although it had been around since 1961, there had not been an American executive director, and Clayton Yida recommended to Jim Baker, recommended to the president, that we should consider having an American executive director. And then ultimately the White House and the State Department worked in order to achieve that, and therefore I went to WFP. But again, the US government was there. Andrew was an associate administrator, AID, as a matter of fact, and they were very creative. Andrew was amazingly not just supportive, but creative, for instance, in giving funding to create a vulnerability mapping system, which is greatly expanded and hugely helpful to this day, to map the areas that are the most food insecure, and therefore to be able to target the people that were most in need. And it's been used in practically every country which needs food assistance ever since then. And that's just one of many examples of the US leadership in the Bush administration in an effort to support not only current needs, but build systems for the future. And you know, every one of the initiatives that I mentioned had ongoing success stories afterwards. DHA becoming OCHA, becoming a major coordination, support for the VAM, the Vulnerability Mapping System, now becoming a key part of this whole attention to hungry people around the world. Then US was very supportive in the creation of logistics capacity, and now there's an airline called UNHAS, the UN Humanitarian Air Service, run by the World Food Program, which is the air service not only for movement of shipment of food and other goods, but also people, humanitarian air transport service all around the world. But that started also with generous creative ideas from the US government. So there were a lot of people working on these matters because they understood the bigger picture that the president wanted to achieve. One of that I mentioned in my chapter that is not often talked about is the president's commitment to women and to gender issues. And he decided, for instance, that when he appointed the person to head essentially the women's office at the State Department for the Committee on the Status of Women Representative, that he knew from his own work in the UN that the person who took that job was going to have much more influence if, in fact, he named her as an ambassador. So Judy McClennan was the first US ambassador for women, essentially. And afterwards, presidents followed that. President Obama enhanced that office. But nonetheless, the first person to pay attention to the fact that it would make a difference in negotiating for more women to be at the table, for more women at the UN, for more women in leadership, that was George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, I didn't realize until Andrew mentioned in his foreword that Bush was very much of a Edmund Burke, and that his philosophy was very much like the philosophy of Edmund Burke. And then when I finally paid attention to that through Andrew's writing, I thought, aha, this is another reason why he's been so successful. He knows where he wants to go and he knows why he wants to get there. And then he was able to build not only the initiatives in terms of the policies that he wanted to achieve, but the capacity through the leaders that he put in place in order to be successful. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you so much. Dr. Paal, thank you so much. You wrote a chapter called President George H.W. Bush's China Policy. George H.W. Bush represented the United States to the People's Republic of China in the Ford administration. I think he spoke some Mandarin. He had a unique understanding of the People's Republic of China. And I think it's fair to say he understood China better than any president before or since. I think that's fair to say. And he had to manage a series of crises and conflicting interests with our relations with the People's Republic of China. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. And I very much want to thank the organizers of the volume, because they gave me a chance to tell some stories about what was really not the most wonderful period of the George Bush time in office. It's a great irony that he had invested time, as you say, in being ambassador to what was then a legation or a liaison office in Beijing in the 1970s for a little over a year. But he really got into it. He and Mrs. Bush, even their son George W. Bush, visited, and it had a big impression on him. And it wasn't just that period in office. When Vice President George H.W. Bush, I could always count on him to invest time with either old friends or people he should or wanted to keep up with in China during the Reagan administration. And he was always the man to turn to make sure that we could give the Chinese the kind of face they always sought, and for him to sort of stay abreast of what was happening in that rapidly dynamic, changing China of the 1980s. And when he started off in office in 1989 on his own, the first thing he wanted to do was to get to China to see Deng Xiaoping, to take advantage of the personal linkages he had made in the 70s and subsequently, and try to build for the future. It's, the great sadness is that due to events beyond anybody's control inside China, the great cataclysm took place, which culminated in the Tiananmen Massacre, or the incident of 1989, June 1989, and which we're going to be commemorating again in a few days. Despite the setback that this meant for his time in office and his hopes for building on the years he'd invested in China, the US had invested in a common relationship with China that served to stabilize the Cold War and offset the power of the Soviet Union. He had visions that in the succeeding years, we could do things with China that would make further progress for both China, for the US, and for the region. But Tiananmen set that back. Then in the aftermath, of course, in American politics, everybody said, oh, you have responsibility for what happens in China, even if there's nothing you can do about it. But it was typical of President Bush that he did try to keep the American hand in the situation, to play what cards we could with the Chinese. And he sent Brent Scowcroft on a secret trip with Larry Eagleburger to China to try to make sure there was a bottom on what was falling through the floor on the US-China relations, which was still cooperation against the Soviet Union, still existed, hadn't yet collapsed. And to try to get the Chinese to take some steps that would, somewhat improve their reputation among the American people after the cataclysm of the crackdown at Tiananmen. One of the things I take away from this volume as a whole is to look at the chapters by Zelikow and Rice and others on what happened in Europe and with the collapse of the Soviet Union during Bush's subsequent time in office.
So sorry, let me interrupt. We're at minute 59. We only are now coming to this. Thank you, Dr. Paal. I agree. It's just so many things that happened at this period. It was so consequential, but please go on, Dr. Paal.
Well, just to say that here, if you go fast forward 30 years, today we're trying to deal with, an extant major power in competition with us in China. And if you go back and look at how we tried to politicize and not just militarize the transition in Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we tried to get some principles on which to sustain one Europe whole and free. That was the ambition. Never quite achieved, but it wasn't George H.W. Bush's problem at that point. And today we're looking for some way to manage the military and economic challenge of China. And we're tending to militarize it rather than to find political and diplomatic solutions. And I think those are the lessons, and trade solutions too. I think those are the lessons you find in the other chapters of the book that could be brought forward to where we are today.
There was a reason I wanted you on this panel. That's exactly, thank you for that. Thank you very much. Okay, so a little bit, let me come to each of, so Ambassador Hills, Ambassador Pickering, Catherine Bertini, what is the one big takeaway either from the book or from your service in the administration for current and future policymakers from the presidency of George H.W. Bush? Ambassador Pickering, let me start with you.
I think that perhaps the single policy recommendation that I would emphasize was that President George H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, and Secretary Baker ran a coordinated administration, making sure that all the pieces knew what was going on. They were all fitted together, and they had a comprehensive idea of how all of that work should be carried out. Much of it was thought about, cogitated with at the National Security Council, but they were careful not to involve the National Security Council into implementation and execution, which they kept in the hands of the major departments and agencies. And my sense was that it was an example. Certainly, Brent Scowcroft's NSC goes down in history for many as the best of its type ever. But I think that the president's interest in knowledge and comprehension of foreign affairs and defense policy and Secretary Baker's enormous energy and great capacity to get things done and tremendous footwork as a major diplomat all made a great deal of difference in how and in what way that administration worked and was seen and pulled together. It's a goal no other administration has achieved. It will remain as an example for all future administrations.
Ambassador Hills, what would your takeaway?
My takeaway is there are two qualities that are indispensable for a president. One is the experience, and I've already mentioned the deep experience of President Bush. And as others have mentioned as well, his selection of people who have experience like Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft. And that really matters. It matters as you can better understand what are the political problems faced on the other side of the table. And so you better lay out a more functional blueprint and plan to carry out that blueprint. And secondly, diplomacy matters hugely. You know, calling the other side names doesn't advance your cause. You may think it helps you with politics at home, but it makes the mountain much steeper. President Bush was a master at what Gandhi used to say is you don't make a deal with a clenched fist. You make it with an open hand. And he was trying, and because of his diplomatic experience and picking people like Tom Pickering, people who had huge amounts of experience and ability, made a difference. And so I would say to the population at large, look for your president who has experience and has demonstrated a capacity for diplomacy if you want to move ahead in international affairs.
Thanks, Ambassador. Catherine Bertini, what are some lessons for current policymakers or future policymakers?
Dan, one of them was said by Andy Card earlier when he talked about President Bush working in creating a climate of respect. And in the international community, there's no way we can be successful without being respectful of the all of the people with whom we're working and all of the people whom we're trying to serve. So that's number one in terms of operations. And then I think the second point is that he and we should think about objectives we want to achieve over the long term. The short-term objectives only are not what's going to change the world, but the long-term objectives are. And just as some examples of this, for instance, in Ambassador Pickering's chapter, he talks about UN reform. It didn't happen during the time of George Bush, but the seeds were planted there through the work that Ambassador and others did. And then ultimately when Kofi Annan became Secretary General, they weren't new ideas, a lot of them. And in fact, he did implement many of the things that came up through the Bush era. Another example is that when I talked about South Africa, what was done during apartheid with respect to reaching people who were in need of food was very helpful to build relationships that were then useful once apartheid fell, especially relationships between South Africa and the other countries. So the idea about women, also the one I mentioned about putting an ambassador level person in to promote more women in the system. Over the short term, maybe there wasn't as much success, but over the long term, the building blocks were there so that there are many, many, many more women now in the UN system, in part because of the push by the American government under George Herbert Walker Bush. So climate of respect and the long-term view and taking actions and decisions based on where our country wants to be or help the world to be over the long term are the two lessons I'd suggest.
Dr. Paal, you gave some leave behinds earlier, but I want to give you another chance to add any additional thoughts.
Well, I think if you read through the book, you'll see three things that I think were important in the Bush legacy. One was what most good diplomats have, which is empathy for the other party in your negotiation, some sense of what they need as well as what you need. Secondly is imaginative use of the toolbox. You don't just have one weapon or one tool, you have a multiplicity and you use them where they advantage your cause and consider the other side's interests as well. And the final one is no surprises. I'll give you an example. In the 1992 period, the US had tensions with China over Taiwan, as was often the case. A few weeks ago, just recently, The Economist wrote that Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. I don't think that's correct, but if you go back to 1992, you can see Bush had multiple tools at work. He agreed to sell 150 F-16 aircraft, first major arms sale to Taiwan in the aftermath of the normalization of relations. He also sent or asked Carla Hills to go as the first cabinet representative to Taiwan since normalization. But then to make sure this didn't just, disorient the entire East Asia region, he had me bring in who is today's China's foreign policy leader, Yang Jiechi, to visit in the family quarters and to brief him in advance that he planned to do these things and that he was not intending to dismantle the relationship, but that he would, over the long term, try to keep balance in our various relationships so that there were, it was a complete package. It wasn't just a one-off here and a one-off there. He knew where he wanted to go and he brought all the parts together.
Great. Okay, I've got some really interesting questions. I really appreciate you, Dr. Paal, raising the fall of the Berlin Wall and Europe Poland free. I mean, I could have had an additional person just to speak about that, and there were several chapters in the book, and including from a major German policymaker that Andrew Natsios referenced earlier. So my friend, Dr. Diana Negroponte, who's written two interesting books relevant to this conversation. One is Seeking Peace in El Salvador, which I highly recommend. I've read. And also she just recently published a book called Master Negotiator, which is a book about James Baker's time as Secretary of State. So her question is, Loyalty was a key principle for George H.W. Bush, but his loyalty to Gorbachev after the August coup in 1991 meant that he failed to recognize Boris Yeltsin's new role. Was loyalty taken too far in this instance? Maybe Ambassador Pickering, could I impose upon you to take a stab at that one? You're welcome.
Thank you. A not unvexed problem, and one certainly that we need to pay a lot of attention to. I've just gotten done reading within the last day a book about the period that you're talking about by the British ambassador at the time. He and I think, both agree that the question of how and in what way to pick up Boris Yeltsin, while he was in effect elbowing aside Gorbachev, was a very difficult one. And the president's feeling of personal loyalties in those particular periods of time, I think, held him in thrall a bit, as he had to find a way also to open the line to Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a much less sympathetic figure than Gorbachev. And the aftermath of the August coup meant that Gorbachev's half-life was then 4 months. And it became very clear, as a reading of this book shows, that by September, October, it was apparent to everybody that Gorbachev was on his way out without any great certainty about how Yeltsin would move in, which he did very, very quickly, and in fact controlled things in a way that meant that as much as we were interested in, beholden to, and friendly with Gorbachev, he was no longer a player. I was struck by the fact that the election of 1996, which took place obviously some years following, one of the candidates was
the election in Russia.
What?
The election in Russia.
In 1996, yes. One of the candidates was named Gorbachev. And it was very clear to all of us who watched it that Gorbachev would not make 1% of the vote, and he didn't. On the other hand, the American television stations, including most of the regular ones, the whole election day covering Gorbachev as if and somehow he was something that was going to move in and take control of Russia again and be a kind of new savior of the regime.
Thanks, Ambassador. Ambassador Hills, I got another question for you. With the from Samuel, I don't have Samuel's last name, but with the renegotiation of NAFTA and tensions with China, we're seeing a degree of protectionism return to U.S. trade relations. How do you think President George H.W. Bush would have responded to our current trade challenges?
President Bush was a multilateralist. He believed that countries that had experience of trade with one another developed bonds and reduced friction. And he was instrumental in trying to push that forward. You remember, it was the Uruguay round that he was interested in when he took office, that was to upgrade the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and created the World Trade Organization. Indeed, the Uruguay round cratered in Brussels in '91, just as we started the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Within 4 months of President Clinton getting Congress to approve the North American Free Trade Agreement, all then 123 members of the GATT came back and approved the WTO and the new rules, then new, and borrowed from the North American Free Trade Agreement the rules governing intellectual property, investment, services, and trade enforcement. So he was definitely not a fan of protectionism, thinking that that would restrict your economic growth and also create fractious barriers that could lead to problems in the geopolitical realm. And he kept both this balance very, very much in mind when he talked to other countries about opening their markets and the benefits that they would get from opening their markets, including our own. And he spoke to our Congress, which was not just automatically pro-trade, but when they heard his rationale and we could talk to them about our expectations, it really helped. And we need that now.
So this is a question for Andrew Natsios and Andy Card. What was surprise? Both of you have read the book and both of you worked on the book. Was there something what surprised each of you in the process of editing the book? Andrew, you first, please.
Well, I when I was writing the introduction, I had in mind Ryan Crocker saying, Bush failed in Afghanistan. So I started actually going through the library documents, and I found this executive order where he ordered, very early on, he ordered AID to start a reconstruction program. I said, I never heard of any of this. And I started looking into it, and there are some things written, but very little. And in fact, we spent several $100 million. During the 1990s, AID spent $1 billion, but it turned, because of the civil war that was going on, we had to divert much of the funding to keep people alive who have died otherwise, instead of in reconstruction. But that's not because he made a mistake. It's because we could not control all the events on the ground. So I think one thing that George Bush understood is that American leadership in the world is critically important, but we cannot control all the forces at work in the world. And it's naive, it's an arrogant swarm of naivete to think that we can. And America gets into a lot of trouble either when they just say, we're not going to get involved. It's a form of isolationism, or we say we're going to remake the entire world order in our own image, make every country look like Kansas City. It doesn't work that way. Okay, the world is a complex place. We can make incremental change, as Edmund Burke suggested. I'm glad Catherine brought that up. Edmund Burke believed in slow, incremental, careful change, and that's what George Bush believed in. I might add another thing. The notion that we can do all of this alone without allies is utter nonsense. We have an alliance system since the end of the Second World War that successive presidents have built up with 58 other countries. And that is why the United States dominated the international system, to protect our interests and to protect their interests. This has to be a two-way street. It's not just all about America. It's what we can do jointly together that protects our interests and other countries' interests who are allies. So the alliance system that George Bush cultivated, encouraged, and expanded is something that we're losing now. And I might add, it's not a function of one single president. That has been deteriorated over a period of years. It's not a good thing. And the Chinese, you know how many allies China has? They have North Korea, Cuba, and maybe Laos. I mean,
it's not a big list.
It's not a big list. One of our greatest strengths is that we have a large number of countries that have formal and informal agreements with the United States. We need to rebuild that alliance system, which President Bush cultivated and strengthened while he was president.
Andy Card, what was the surprise takeaway from you from this process?
It's the process told me how spectacular the team was that he recruited. It was a remarkable team that was really focused on, I'm going to say, his long-term goals. They were not struggling to meet tomorrow's need. They wanted to meet the day after tomorrow's need and go forward. And so he was patient. He was patient. He listened. He didn't encourage mission creep, but he didn't let us creep our mission. He was very focused on making sure that we understood what his expectations were. And then he wanted to help us meet his expectations. So he was a partner with us. He didn't just instruct us and then walk away. And he actually would help lift us up if we needed to be lifted up. And I was impressed that he had such good peripheral vision of the people on his team that needed to be lifted up every once in a while.
Well, let me just add one last story. I was the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. It was my first job, and then I became assistant. So I managed basically the humanitarian relief functions internationally of USAID. And this is my first job at the federal level. I was a state government official before that, a state legislator. And it was very interesting. We were engaged in a massive expansion of that office. We went from $20 million to $200 million, and we were our work dramatically expanded around the world. There was someone supporting us, and we never understood who it was. I thought it was Larry Eagleburger, because whenever we'd have fights with other bureaus in the State Department or AID or the NSC or the Defense Department, someone was intervening because we always won the fights. And I couldn't understand who it was until 3 months before we left office, after Bush had been defeated. He was the one that intervened. And I found out that he would say, just leave them alone and let them get their work done and stop fighting with them. And he deliberately didn't tell us he was doing that, because I don't think he wanted us to get arrogant about it. All I knew was the fighting used to just end, and the work we were doing, all the refuse that was causing trouble would just end. And it took me all that time in office to realize he was the one watching he knew every time we sent teams out exactly where they were and what they were doing. I was astonished. He made a comment to someone in Boston at a speech. In fact, it was to Paul Cellucci, the former governor. He said, if Andrew was here, Paul Cellucci, later governor, said, if Andrew was here, this would be happening. And the president said, oh no, he's in Bangladesh right now with a team because of this tsunami. And Paul said, you know where Andrew is? He said, I know where Andrew is whenever he leaves the country. And he used to read the reports that we sent to the White House on what was going on. He actually read them. So there was an attention to detail in terms of bureaucratic infighting that increased the chances of success of what we were doing. Anyway, I just wanted to add that story in.
He also had the capacity to contact people when he didn't need to. And it was especially other leaders around the world. He would call and say, how are you doing? I've been thinking about you. It wasn't asking for anything. It was kind of preemptive care. And it became contagious for the rest of us, as he taught us how to build a relationship that might be needed. But it wasn't quite that Machiavellian. He had empathy. I like the term when empathy came up. He did lead with empathy. He understood what it was like to receive a direction that came from a president or others. And so when he gave an order, he gave it with empathy for the person who was going to receive the order.
Douglas Paal, how did President Bush balance the need to work with China versus his desire to protect human rights in China?
You know, I try to document in the chapter how at the end of the administration, or at the end of 1989 and through 90, we tried to get substantive changes in human rights in China, namely reopening access to Voice of America, releasing prisoners who had been taken into custody and sentenced after Tiananmen, and to get a release of prominent intellectuals overseas. On the release of prominent, I documented the Fang Li-Zhi case, the professor of astrophysics who was kind of the Sakharov of the Chinese system, and through Jim Lilly, our Bush appointed ambassador, that was executed. It was very close run, very tough. In the second Scowcroft trip with Eagleburger to China, Deng Xiaoping had said that he wanted to get back in American good graces, and he had some terms on offer that he presented to President Nixon. We went back over to follow up with it and achieved what was only a temporary success, which was China did promise to start releasing prisoners, reopen VOA. And then unpredictably in Romania, Ceausescu, the leader of Romania, was put up against a wall with his wife and machine gunned to death. And the Chinese leadership saw the videos of this event, and that brought to a quick halt what had been agreed just a week before in terms of releasing human rights. So he wanted to do it, as always, quietly if possible, effectively as he could. But sometimes you're up against a situation where there's only so much you can do. And you make your effort. I try to document the effort that was made, but the beast that was the Chinese leadership had its own appetites and demands, and we had to get through that. Now you could ask a little bit legitimate questions. How do you restart something like that? And we went through the Clinton period, which I discuss a little bit in the chapter, but you can look up on your own.
Okay, Catherine Bertini, we haven't used the term yet, but Richard Haas's chapter is entitled A Compassionate Realist, and some of the comments you made in your intervention reflect this concept of a compassionate realist. Wanted to give you just a chance to kind of either add to that, but the other thing I was hoping you might speak to is the United Nations is a vehicle for burden sharing, not just political burden sharing, but resource burden sharing. And there's been lots of debate and discussion in the last 10 or so years about, is the United States carrying its fair share, et cetera? How would you talk either about this issue of George H.W. Bush being a compassionate realist, or talk about the United Nations and this issue of burden sharing, which I know that George H.W. Bush understood so well?
Sure, he certainly did understand, Dan, and he when he took office, there were systems in place where the U.S. would only do a certain thing in terms of how it was going to support international work. For instance, it would send food, but not send the money to manage the food or to pay for the staff to manage the food, and had a very cavalier attitude about it. Well, that's what the Europeans do. And as you can imagine, it wasn't a very popular program from the perspective of the Europeans or the Canadians or any of the other major donors. So the administration understood that and was able to help migrate the programming into a cash sharing system. And Andrew was part of Andrew, I think, worked his whole life at USAID in both administrations to get more cash into the system beyond the in-kind. But the issue was, yes, we have a burden to share, and we can't just do it the same way we've always done it. We have to do something collaborative with everybody else. So I think that's an example both of sharing part of the burden at the UN and of his realistic perspective.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to give you the last word. If you want any last parting thoughts, this is it, Andrew.
UN officials typically don't say this publicly. They say it privately. They know it. Everybody knows it, but they don't say anything. Even our adversaries know it. The international system that we constructed after World War II does not work without American leadership. It just doesn't. And Secretary General Guterres said it himself publicly. I got the quote down, and it wasn't something he planned to say, but I don't know the exact year, but he made the comment in front of the press, and he's absolutely right. The system does work, but you have to cultivate it. You have to work the system, as Tom Pickering was saying. And so I think American leadership in the world does make a huge difference. We can't take the arrogant view that we can control everything everywhere and always make it come out the right way. On the other hand, simply standing there and saying, oh, it's not our business, we're not going to deal with it, let it just take its course, we'll let the system collapse, it's not our problem. That's also dangerous. And in George Bush, I think, and that's what the book is about, is took a balanced view of those two extremes, which is, let's intervene where we can make a difference, and let's make sure we succeed by attention to detail. And don't start making statements that we're not going to be able to fulfill the promises that we make. So I think there is a more centrist view of what we do in the world that's more realistic, but also takes into account what America is capable of doing. I got to finish with one story. There was a famine beginning in the Ethiopian civil war in both Tigray and Eritrea. This is when Mengistu was still in power. And the Eritrean rebel leader, who's now the president of Eritrea, would not allow us to bring food into Massawa, the World Food Program. It was American food on, and WFP was delivering the food, but they couldn't deliver it because he said, Isaiah Sapperworky, I don't want the central government to get credit for this food, so we'll basically let our people starve rather than accept the food. So he threatened, and my job was to get him out of the way. But the president of Ethiopia, the Marxist dictator who was a client state of the Soviet Union, Mengistu, said, if you land any food in that, we'll blow the barges up with the Ethiopian Air Force. And so Hank Cohen and I sent a note to the White House saying what happened. We didn't ask for any action. All of a sudden, Mengistu announced, for humanitarian reasons, we've decided to open the port up. I said, Mengistu doesn't care about the port. He wants to kill everyone. And we couldn't understand what happened. Apparently, Bush called Gorbachev personally and said, get your friend off the dime and open that port up. And Gorbachev called Mengistu and threatened him that all military assistance would be ended immediately with Ethiopia if they did not open the port up. And Mengistu, within a few days of Gorbachev's call, ended that. No one even knows this story. I mean, it's almost unknown that this happened. And yet, the great story is Hank Cohen called me up and told me what happened. He said, we didn't know what happened because Gorbachev and Bush's call was not done through the foreign ministry of the State Department. He made a direct call to him, and he had Gorbachev call up Mengistu and threaten him. And that's the kind of leadership where America does make a difference. And we didn't have a famine as a result of that. No one died in terms of starvation deaths. So it does count. American leadership does count in the world.
Thank you all. I'm really so appreciative all of you would take so much time to help CSIS convene this conversation about transforming our world. President George H.W. Bush and American foreign policy. I'm really grateful to all of you. This has been really tremendous. I so appreciate it. Thank you all for doing this.